Every building you've ever lived in probably has the same kind of door. A slab of wood or metal hanging from hinges on one side, swinging open into the room or out into a hallway. You've been opening doors like that since you could walk, and so did your parents, and so did theirs. It feels obvious. It feels like the only way a door could work. So when you see a traditional Japanese house for the first time, with its low-pitched tiled roof and its raised wooden floor and its inner garden visible through the entryway, the doors look wrong. They're thin wooden frames covered in paper, actual paper, and they don't swing. They glide sideways along a wooden track cut into the floor, disappearing behind the adjacent panel like a whisper. No hinges, no handle, no lock, no deadbolt. Just a sheet of translucent paper stretched across a lattice of cedar, and the whole thing weighs almost nothing. And the first reaction from most people outside Japan, whether it's a tourist walking through a ryokan for the first time or an architecture student flipping through a textbook, is always the same. That can't possibly work. That's not a real door. That wouldn't survive a week in my house. So how did an entire civilization build some of the most durable, longest-lasting wooden structures on the planet using doors you could put your fist through? Japan's earliest version of that fragile-looking paper door was actually borrowed from somewhere else entirely. Chinese folding screens had been used as room partitions since at least 200 BCE. And when Japanese envoys began traveling to the Chinese imperial court between the 7th and 8th centuries, they brought the concept back with them across the East China Sea. Those original Chinese screens were bulky, heavy wooden frames, useful for blocking a line of sight inside a palace hall, but not much else. They didn't slide. They didn't filter light. They were furniture, not architecture. Before the 7th century, Japanese homes didn't have fixed interior walls either, but they also didn't have elegant solutions for dividing space. Early dwellings were pit-style structures with thatched roofs, and later aristocratic buildings used hanging curtains and freestanding fabric panels to mark off areas within large open halls. It worked, but it was clumsy. The fabric sagged, the partitions fell over. The rooms they created felt temporary because they were. The real shift happened in 610 AD, when a Korean Buddhist monk named Doncho arrived in Japan carrying something that would reshape the country's entire relationship with interior space. He brought the Chinese methods of making ink and paper. The Chronicles of Japan, a historical text completed in 720 AD, recorded the event specifically, and it's one of those small, quiet moments in history that changed far more than anyone at the time could have predicted. Doncho would look back on that arrival and never know what it eventually built. The paper Doncho introduced was made from hemp and other plant fibers using Chinese techniques, and it was fine for writing on, but it was too thin and too fragile to do much else with. Japan's Prince Regent Shotoku saw the limitation immediately. He pushed his craftsmen to experiment with kozo, the inner bark fiber of the paper mulberry tree, which was already being cultivated across the mountainous islands of Shikoku and Kyushu for use in textiles. Kozo fibers were longer, stronger, and more flexible than anything the Chinese process used. The paper-making process that evolved from Shotoku's push became known as Nagashizuki, and it was brutal, physical work. Farmers did it in winter, after the rice harvest, because the cold temperatures were essential. Cold water keeps bacteria from decomposing the plant fibers during processing, and cold air makes the fibers contract and interlock more tightly, producing a crisper, tougher sheet. The kozo branches were steamed, stripped of their bark, boiled in an alkaline solution to soften the fibers, rinsed in cold running water, and beaten by hand until the pulp was fine enough to suspend evenly in water. Then the papermaker scooped the pulp onto a bamboo screen, rocking it back and forth in a precise rhythm to build up layers. The resulting sheet of paper was not the flimsy white sheet you'd load into a printer. Kozo-based washi has a tensile strength closer to cloth than to modern wood pulp paper, because the fibers are dramatically longer and they interlock and tangle in ways that short wood pulp fibers simply can't replicate. A single sheet of quality washi can be folded, crumpled, and unfolded again without tearing. You can get it wet and it holds together. You can stretch it across a frame and it stays taut for years. Even today, kozo accounts for roughly 90% of all washi production in Japan, and sheets of it have survived in Buddhist temples and imperial archives for over 1,000 years. In 2014, UNESCO added traditional Japanese hand papermaking to its representative list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity, recognizing 3 specific regional washi traditions that have been passed down through families for generations. And no, the 1,000-year survival claim isn't an exaggeration. Documents written on washi during the Nara period in the 8th century are still legible and physically intact today. Try that with a modern printed page and see how it looks after 50 years in a humid room. With washi available as a building material, the Japanese did something that no other architectural tradition was doing at the same time. They started using it to make walls, and then doors, and then entire facades of buildings that glowed from the inside like paper lanterns when a candle was lit at night. A row of traditional homes along a Kyoto street at dusk, each one softly luminous behind its shoji screens, looks nothing like any other streetscape on Earth. The 2 main types of sliding doors evolved separately, but from the same root. Fusuma, the opaque version, appeared during the Heian period between 794 and 1185. They were originally called fusuma shoji and were used in the mansions of Japanese nobility to temporarily divide what was, essentially, one enormous room. The panels were thick, covered on both sides with layers of Torinoko paper or fabric stretched over a wooden lattice frame, and they slid along wooden grooves. The upper groove, carved into the header beam, was called the kamoi. The lower groove, cut into the floor rail, was called the shiki. Together, these tracks held the panel in place while allowing it to glide with almost no friction. During the Kamakura period, between 1185 and 1333, the opaque fusuma and the translucent shoji split into distinct categories with distinct jobs. Fusuma became room dividers and interior doors, often painted with elaborate landscapes, seasonal scenes, and figures from Japanese mythology in a tradition called fusuma-e. The greatest painters of their era worked on fusuma panels, the way European artists worked on cathedral ceilings, and surviving examples from the Momoyama period in the late 16th century are considered national treasures. Shoji became the exterior-facing screens, the ones that filtered natural sunlight into that soft, diffused glow that photographs of traditional Japanese interiors are famous for. There were even specialized variants. Yukimi shoji, which translates to snow viewing shoji, had a bottom panel that slid upward to reveal a clear view of a winter garden through the glass underneath. For most of their history, fusuma and shoji were luxuries reserved for the aristocracy and the warrior class. Ordinary people used simpler partitions or none at all. That changed during the Edo period, between 1603 and 1868, when a boom in woodblock printed karakami paper made decorative fusuma affordable for merchant-class households and eventually for common homes as well. By the 20th century, a house with both Western-style rooms and Japanese-style rooms divided by fusuma had become standard across the country. The sliding door went from a noble's luxury to something so ordinary that most Japanese people stopped thinking of it as remarkable at all. And this is where things get really interesting, because none of this was just about aesthetics. Japan sits on top of 4 colliding tectonic plates: the Pacific Plate, the Philippine Sea Plate, the Eurasian Plate, and the North American Plate, all converge directly beneath the Japanese archipelago, driven by subduction forces that push one plate beneath another at rates of up to 11 centimeters per year. The country records roughly 1,500 earthquakes that humans can actually feel every single year. That's about 4 per day, and those are just the ones strong enough to notice. Include the micro-tremors that only seismometers detect, and the total climbs past 100,000 annually. You'd think someone would have said something about building with stone. Nobody did, because everyone who tried it in Japan learned the same lesson. Think about what a heavy stone wall with a heavy wooden door hanging from iron hinges does in an earthquake. All that mass wants to keep moving when the ground shakes. Walls crack apart along their mortar lines. Ceilings. loaded with the weight of tile roofing, collapse inward. Doors jam in their frames because the frame itself has shifted and the rigid hinge points can no longer align. People get trapped inside rooms they can't exit. This isn't a hypothetical scenario. The 1995 Kobe earthquake killed over 6,000 people, and a significant number of those deaths came from people being crushed inside their own homes by the collapse of heavy structural elements, fallen roof beams, and jammed exit doors. A traditional Japanese house handles the same earthquake in a completely different way. The wooden post and beam frame flexes rather than fracturing. The joints, which aren't nailed or bolted but interlocked through precision mortise and tenon carpentry techniques refined over centuries, absorb and redistribute seismic force rather than resisting it. Japanese pagodas use this principle at massive scale. The 5-story pagoda at Horyuji Temple near Nara, built in the 7th century, has a shinbashira, a massive central pillar that the individual stories can slide against during an earthquake. The pillar acts like a spine, absorbing the lateral force while the floors shift around it. The same concept now informs the engineering of modern Japanese skyscrapers. And the sliding doors themselves? They're the lightest elements in the entire structure. If a fusuma falls off its track during a tremor, it weighs a few kilograms. It lands on you like a blanket, not like a wall. And because there are no hinges to jam and no heavy door to wedge shut in a warped frame, the exits stay clear. You can slide a shoji aside with one finger, even if the building around it has shifted several centimeters from its original position. The same quality that made European visitors call these houses flimsy is exactly what made them survivable across 1,000 years of continuous seismic activity. But earthquakes are only half the engineering story. Japan's climate, particularly in the central and southern regions, is the opposite of what most of Western Europe deals with. Summers are brutally hot and humid, with temperatures routinely above 35 degrees Celsius, and relative humidity climbing past 80% for weeks during the rainy season called tsuyu. Mold, mildew, and wood rot are constant threats. In fact, the Japanese developed an entire vocabulary around seasonal mold because it was so much a part of daily life. And then winter arrives, cold and dry, and the air pulls moisture out of everything it touches. Viruses thrive in that dryness. Traditional Western building materials handle neither extreme well. A stone or brick building in this climate traps moisture in summer and breeds mold in the joints. It holds heat when you want coolness and radiates cold when you want warmth. A traditional Japanese wooden house, on the other hand, breathes. Wood naturally absorbs excess humidity in wet weather and releases stored moisture when the air dries out. Washi paper does the same thing, acting almost like a membrane. Together, wood framing and paper walls function as a passive climate control system, keeping indoor humidity hovering around 60% year-round, which is the range most comfortable for human beings and least hospitable for mold growth. And here's the part that takes the engineering even further. Because shoji and fusuma aren't attached to their frames by hinges, they can be removed entirely. In summer, a homeowner lifts the panels out of their tracks and stores them in a closet. What was a 4-room house 5 minutes ago is now a single open pavilion with a cross breeze running straight through it from the garden to the street. When autumn arrives and the air cools, the panels come back out and the rooms reappear. You can't do that with hinged doors set into permanent drywall. You can't pick up your living room wall and put it in the closet until October. If you're finding this interesting, subscribe. This channel covers the history and engineering behind the things we take for granted every week. While the practical reasons for paper sliding doors are fascinating on their own, something else was happening in Japanese architecture that had nothing to do with earthquakes or humidity. The buildings were expressing a completely different philosophy about what a room actually is. In European architecture, going back to the Romans, a room is a fixed, defined space. You walk through a door, into an enclosure, with 4 solid walls, a ceiling, and a designated purpose. The dining room is the dining room. The bedroom is the bedroom. The boundaries are permanent, and the function is decided by the architect or the builder, not by the person living there. Japanese architecture, especially from the Heian period forward, rejected that idea entirely. The Shinden-zukuri mansions built for Heian-era aristocrats between the 9th and 12th centuries were famous for having almost no fixed interior walls at all. The main hall, called the Shinden, was a single vast open space raised on wooden stilts above the ground. Privacy wasn't created by permanent walls. It was created by portable screens, hanging curtains called sudare, and eventually by the sliding fusuma panels that could be rearranged at will. A research paper published through the Architectural Institute of Japan on the origins of Shinden-zukuri confirmed that these Heian period residences rarely had walls or windows in the way that contemporary buildings in the rest of the world did. The spatial openness was the defining architectural feature, and it is the direct ancestor of the flexible interior that became standard in later Japanese residential design. In the latter half of the 10th century, sliding doors were developed to replace those earlier curtains and portable screens, and they changed the spatial structure of Japanese houses dramatically. A household could host a formal reception in the morning, slide the fusuma panels into new positions after lunch, and create 3 separate private sleeping rooms by evening. The same physical footprint served completely different functions depending on how the occupants arranged the doors. The architecture adapted to the people rather than forcing the people to adapt to the architecture. This was hundreds of years before the phrase open plan entered the vocabulary of Western design magazines. Japan had been doing it since the 10th century. They just called it living. The Muromachi period, roughly 1338 to 1573, evolved this principle further with the development of Shoin-zukuri, a new architectural style influenced by Zen Buddhist monasteries. Shoin-zukuri standardized the use of tatami mats across entire floor surfaces, square wooden posts, and rooms defined almost exclusively by sliding fusuma and shoji panels rather than fixed walls. It also introduced the tokonoma, a recessed alcove for displaying a scroll painting or a flower arrangement, which became a focal point precisely because the rest of the room was deliberately neutral and adaptable. This Shoin-zukuri style forms the foundation of what we now think of as a traditional Japanese room, and every single wall in that room moves. Parallel to all of this, the tea ceremony was codifying the philosophy of flexible space into something deliberately spiritual. In the 16th century, the tea master Sen no Rikyu established the grass hut style of tea house, known as son, deliberately small, typically only 2 to 8 tatami mats in total floor area, built entirely from natural materials gathered from the surrounding landscape. The entrance to a traditional Rikyu-style tea house is often a nijiriguchi, a small crawl-through opening roughly 60 centimeters square. You can't stride into a tea room the way you'd shove open a heavy Western door. You have to lower yourself, physically humble yourself, to enter the space. The door itself teaches you how to behave in the room before you've even entered it. Every element of that tea house, the paper walls that filter natural light into something softer and more contemplative, the sliding panels that close the ceremony off from the noise of the outside world, the natural wood and split bamboo that connect the interior to the forest around it, exists to collapse the boundary between inside and outside, between human construction and the natural world. In Japanese aesthetic philosophy, that boundary was always considered artificial anyway. The sliding door doesn't separate you from nature. It negotiates your relationship with it. Now, there's a deeper engineering reason why sliding beats swinging that doesn't get discussed enough outside of Japan. A hinged door needs clearance. When a standard Western door swings open, it sweeps an arc across the floor. That arc is dead space, floor area that nothing else can occupy. No furniture, no person, no storage. In a 2,000 square foot American suburban house, that dead space is a minor inconvenience. Nobody notices it because nobody has to. In a traditional Japanese home, where rooms were measured in tatami mats, and a standard tatami mat measures roughly 91 by 182 centimeters. Every single centimeter of floor space had an assigned function. You sat on the floor, you slept on the floor, you ate on the floor. A swinging door would have stolen usable living space from rooms that were already minimal by Western standards and couldn't afford to lose any of it. A sliding door occupies zero additional floor space when it opens. It moves along the plane of the wall itself. When open, it tucks behind the adjacent panel or recesses into the wall cavity. When closed, it is the wall. That efficiency isn't decorative. In a country with one of the highest population densities in the developed world and a mountainous geography that concentrates most of the habitable land along narrow coastal plains, wasting floor space wasn't a design preference. It was something people couldn't afford. And this is the part where the entire framing of the question starts to flip. We tend to treat Japanese paper doors as the unusual invention, the exotic departure from the norm. We ask, why paper and why sliding? As if the European solid hinged door were the universal default that Japan decided, for mysterious cultural reasons, to deviate from. Historically, that framing is backwards. For most of human architectural history, across most of the inhabited world, interior partitions were soft, flexible, and movable. Curtains, woven mats, animal hides, folding screens. The ancient Egyptians used woven reed partitions in their homes along the Nile. Chinese and Korean buildings used screens and sliding panels for centuries before Japan adopted the practice. South Asian, Southeast Asian, and Polynesian building traditions overwhelmingly favored open-sided structures with flexible partitions or no interior walls at all because those designs made sense for the climates and materials those cultures had available. The heavy, hinged, permanently mounted door set into a thick wall of stone or brick was a specifically European solution to specifically European problems. Cold northern climates, where you needed to seal warmth inside a stone or timber box. Construction traditions inherited from the Roman Empire, which built in stone because stone was abundant around the Mediterranean and impressive enough to communicate imperial authority. And a security environment shaped by centuries of siege warfare and feudal conflict, where a front door needed to be strong enough to resist a battering ram and thick enough to stop an arrow. Japan didn't face those particular problems. Its threats were different in kind, not in seriousness. Earthquakes rather than sieges, humidity rather than freezing cold. The material that made more sense than quarried stone in that environment was the one growing on every mountainside across the archipelago. Wood and paper weren't the backup plan. They were the first and best choice, tested across centuries of actual performance against the actual threats. The wooden 5-story pagoda at Horyuji Temple in Nara was built in the 7th century and is widely recognized as the oldest surviving wooden structure on the planet. It has stood for over 1,300 years in one of the most seismically active regions on Earth. It has outlasted stone castles, brick fortresses, and concrete buildings that would later be constructed and destroyed on the same ground. And its survival comes from the same engineering philosophy that informs a simple shoji screen sitting in a grandmother's house in rural Shikoku. Flexibility over rigidity, lightness over mass, moving with the force instead of bracing against it. Today, traditional machiya townhouses in Kyoto, the narrow wooden homes with their sliding doors and paper walls and their small inner courtyard gardens designed to pull light and air into deep, narrow lots, are disappearing at a rate of roughly 2 per day. They're being torn down and replaced with modern concrete and steel apartment blocks. The economics are hard to argue with. Maintaining a traditional wooden structure costs significantly more than demolishing it and building new. The old buildings don't meet modern earthquake codes that were written with rigid concrete construction in mind, not flexible wood. And younger generations increasingly prefer Western-style apartments with permanent walls, hinged doors, and central air conditioning, which means the architectural tradition that survived 1,000 years of earthquakes developed a passive climate control system centuries before anyone had electricity and invented the concept of flexible open-plan living that the rest of the world is only now discovering is being quietly dismantled. But it's not gone, not yet. Contemporary Japanese architects like Kengo Kuma and Shigeru have built internationally celebrated careers on reinterpreting traditional Japanese spatial concepts for modern buildings. Kuma's work, from the Japan National Stadium in Tokyo to small-scale community centers in rural prefectures, integrates natural materials and translucent screens into contemporary structures that deliberately blur the line between interior and exterior, exactly the way a shoji screen has done for 1,000 years. Ban became famous worldwide for building disaster relief shelters out of paper tubes and cardboard partitions, applying the same lightness and flexibility logic that shaped traditional Japanese homes to one of the most urgent problems in modern humanitarian response. After the 2011 earthquake and tsunami devastated northeastern Japan, Ban developed the paper partition system to divide gymnasium evacuation shelters into private family spaces. He gave displaced families the same kind of movable, temporary, dignified privacy that fusuma panels had provided in Japanese homes since the Heian period. And in Western architecture, the concepts that Japanese sliding doors represent, flexible living space, open floor plans, dissolving the hard boundary between interior and exterior, have become some of the most influential design ideas of the past half-century. Modern office design with its movable partition walls, residential loft living with its absence of corridors, glass curtain walls that turn entire building facades into windows, pocket doors that slide into walls instead of swinging into rooms. All of them carry the fingerprint of a principle that Japanese builders understood and implemented over 1,000 years ago. What survived from that tradition isn't just the physical objects sitting in museums and temples and the few remaining machiya on Kyoto's back streets. It's the idea that a building should be able to breathe, bend, and change shape depending on what the people inside it need. That idea is older than concrete, older than steel, and still shaping buildings being designed right now in cities that have never seen a shoji screen in person. If you want to see how another ancient engineering tradition solved an impossible problem with materials everyone else ignored, the video on screen right now covers exactly that.